Hello, I'm James Andrews, reporter of Food Safety News. I'm here with Shaun Kennedy from the Food System Institute and also adjunct faculty at the University of Minnesota. Um, Shaun, you've spent a lot of your career focused on food defense and bioterrorism. I'm wondering, with new regulation from the Food Safety Modernization Act rolling out, how are we doing in regard to food defense and that sort of thing?
Well, one of the challenges we're facing on food defense is that we haven't had any large-scale incidents in the United States since 2001 of terrorism of any type, other than the bombings in Boston. And so in a lot of places, public attention and company attention on terrorism acts and intentional contamination has been waning. This is even when there have been larger scale attacks in other countries. In Japan, there was a disgruntled worker who contaminated frozen food products, resulting in 2,800 people sick across the country. So we know these acts can happen, but without case demonstrations, it's hard to keep companies interested. That's actually why a lot of my effort has shifted to focus more on food fraud, which is another example of intentional adulteration. But in that case, it's to make money, not to cause harm. But through cases of food fraud, you demonstrate how to get around the quality assurance systems that protect our food. And if you can get around that quality assurance system to make money, you can certainly also get around it to cause harm. So it ends up resulting in companies learning to take the same types of protective measures, but they're doing it for something that protects their bottom line where they're already having problems because food fraud is occurring. GMA estimated that it's $10 to $15 billion a year is lost because of fraud. So it's not an insignificant problem, and that's how we can keep companies more focused on protecting their food system from intentional acts.
Are there foods that are more susceptible to fraud or more commonly used in fraudulent acts compared to other foods?
Well, the true answer is we don't really know because we only know what we catch. So the ones who get away with it and don't get caught, we don't know that it's fraudulent. But of the things that we do find out, there are some that are more common and have historically been more commonly adulterated. Olive oil is often misbranded and mislabeled. That's why the California Olive Oil Association has a certification program so that you can know that it really is California olive oil. There have been problems with honey being fraudulently brought into the country. In that case, it's not that something's been added to it to replace the honey, it's that it has antibiotic residues because of poor production practices in the country of origin, and they're shipping it through other countries to get it here so that they can avoid inspection. So you're ingesting antibiotic-laced honey. There are basically any commodity product and even many specialty products can be subject to it. One of the things that the USP's Intentional Adulteration Committee, the expert panel that I'm a member of, is looking at is how can you give companies some guidance to help them identify which things are more likely to be at risk. As part of that, I developed an initial framework for how to look at characteristics of your food, your supply chain, your supplier relationship, and the like to prioritize which things are more or less likely to be the subject of food fraud. And that expert panel is turning that into an appendix for the USP pharmacopoeia. And I'm also working to come up with a more quantitative means of using that to do risk ranking for firms on how to protect themselves and their products.
Here at IAFP, you were part of a panel discussing food safety versus food security and whether or not we can have both or if one compromises the other. I'm just wondering what your perspective on that is.
Well, we know that under the World Food Congress definition of food security, it says that it is a sufficient, nutritious, safe supply of food for everyone to carry on a healthy life. We tend to think of food security only in the sufficiency context. So if you look at the difference between safety and security, meaning sufficiency, there are cases where there are negative effects of what we do for food safety on food security. The easiest way to think of it is anything that you do to increase the rigor of protecting food safety adds cost. If you add costs, you make food more costly to the consumer. And while in the US, the ability to afford total calories isn't as much of an issue, in the developing world, that is very much an issue. And if you increase the cost, you increase the percentage of the population that will become food insecure. At the same time, you don't want people eating unsafe food and getting sick. But if the consumer has a choice between eating the food they have or a food they can't afford because it's guaranteed safe, they'll eat the food they have. Another way to think about how we make those trade-offs is because of how we perceive risk versus how others may perceive risk. So an easy one to illustrate that is about GMOs, genetically modified organisms. So if a country's developing its agricultural system, and exports of agricultural products are the great way to develop a country's economy, where they export to is going to dictate what growing practices they have in country. And if they export to Europe, they're not going to use GMOs because they don't want to lose access to the European market. And that's due to a perceived risk in Europe about GMOs. So it's a food safety risk. By doing that, they're decreasing the ability to grow the crops they need to meet their own domestic demand. So to satisfy someone else's food safety risk, they're putting themselves at a higher degree of food insecurity.
So in terms of food fraud, I'm wondering if you can talk about how fraudulent food might be considered a food safety issue.
Well, as I said, while the people who commit food fraud don't want to make anyone ill, it kind of hurts repeat business if you make your customers sick, they often don't understand the negative consequences of what they do. So we have had cases of food fraud causing significant public health harm. One of the most famous examples that caused significant illness and death was the fraudulent selling of cooking oil in Spain a while ago that resulted in over 700 people dying. And that was because they didn't understand that the particular denaturation process that was done to that oil was actually going to make people sick. Most people are familiar with the melamine contamination of dairy products in China, which sickened 300,000 children. Again, the people that did that weren't trying to make the children sick. They were trying to make money, but they didn't understand that children would have a health problem with the melamine and the isocyanuric acid crystals, just like the cats and dogs did here in the United States when thousands of cats and dogs were killed by food fraud. One of the more common types of food fraud is species substitution of seafood. And in most cases, it's really you're just getting ripped off. But one of the most popular or most common species to substitute for tuna usually results in a pretty good case of gastric distress. So you went out for a nice piece of tuna, you got this fake fish, and now it's not salmonella, but it feels just about as good. So there are plenty of cases where it does result in health harm. Even in the case of honey, which I mentioned earlier, the reason people worry about that is if you have a sensitivity to the antibiotics that they're using to keep their bee colonies healthy in the country of origin, and you eat that honey not knowing that there is an antibiotic residue there, you will get sick. And so there are other ways in which it contributes to poor health. If you are allergic to dairy proteins, or to certain specific proteins, and they substitute a different protein for that protein, the allergy will result in you being ill. So the challenge for preventing food fraud is you've got people who are very smart about being devious, but not very smart about health. And they don't realize when they're putting the eventual consumer at risk.
So last time I spoke with you, we were talking about your work with food defense and bioterrorism more specifically. I know that when an outbreak happens, one reaction from someone like you who's focused on food defense might be like, well, thank goodness this wasn't intentional. Uh, you know, just looking at how many people can get sick from a mistake, you can kind of extrapolate that to imagine how many people might get sick from intentional contamination. And I'm just wondering what solid concerns are there, and I don't want to scaremonger people, but what solid concerns might there be about a terrorist event or some sort of intentional contamination occurring in the U.S. food chain?
Well, the types of intentional contamination that we see more commonly, that occur regularly, are generally someone trying to get back at someone else, either directly or indirectly. So in recent history, we've had cases that have included criminal prosecution of individuals intentionally contaminating things like salsa at a restaurant because the person was unhappy about how their significant other had been treated. Did it twice, sickened a lot of people. Those types of things are the disgruntled person type, aren't the kind that we worry about when we worry about food defense from the government standpoint. From a company standpoint, if your salsa is intentionally contaminated, it's a negative hit on the company. At a national level, we worry about things that'll cause massive public health harm, and that's what you see in FSMA, in the intentional adulteration rule. The reason for that are that there are things that you can do that would result in truly massive public health harm. And since we last talked, one of the projects that we did at the National Center for Food Protection and Defense was to support developing new food models for the bioterrorism and chemical terrorism risk assessments. That's how the government prioritizes which types of threats are of greater concern. And in looking at that, we were in developing those food models, and then with the government running through the full analysis, you end up with contamination events that can easily result in tens of thousands of rapid casualties. And that can happen. And the characteristics of things that will contribute to that being more likely to be successful if it's attempted is if the product has a large mixing step. So you have a point of contamination in which you could contaminate a lot of servings. Or the product is an ingredient that's used in just the right range of levels in other finished products. So by contaminating the ingredient, you can contaminate not just one product, but many products. And then if you think about the Peanut Corporation of America outbreak, okay, that shows you how broadly a single ingredient, peanut paste, can spread throughout the food industry. So if you have the right devious actor, you could cause massive public health harm beyond just a single product that would be easy to explain to consumers, saying, this food was contaminated, don't eat it, we've taken care of it. If it's this ingredient was contaminated, we think, but it could also be this ingredient, and we now have this list of 20, 30, or 50 products that you shouldn't eat until we figure it out, that the hysteria would be really crippling for the country. So that's why there's an intentional adulteration rule coming out. As part of FSMA was to make sure we thought about those kind of things to prevent them from happening. And whether it's reassuring or not, the result of the risk assessments that I mentioned are that food and agriculture are right at the top of the list of things the government worries about most as far as public health harm.
So speaking of the PCA outbreak, because now the trial with PCA is happening, and Stuart Parnell, the president of PCA, is on trial for, his prosecutors are saying that he intentionally put salmonella-contaminated peanuts out in the supply chain. Would that be considered an act of intentional contamination?
Most of us definitely consider it an act of intentional contamination. They knew they were selling product that was contaminated with salmonella into the marketplace. So that fits the intentional contamination guideline. It wouldn't fall under the FSMA definition of intentional adulteration because it was not intended, nor did it have massive public health harm. While many people did get ill from PCA, it wasn't tens of thousands. It certainly falls into the category of food fraud, because he knew the product was not fit for commerce, and yet he sold it into commerce. As a result, it's still considered adulteration under FDA, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and that's part of the reason why he is being criminally prosecuted. Food fraud doesn't always mean that you added something instead of the thing you were supposed to add. It also includes when you sell something you know you shouldn't be selling. And PCA shouldn't have been selling that peanut paste. Those people shouldn't have gotten ill. And unfortunately, it's a great teaching case for the bad guys to see what you could do. We know that there are some bad guys that have looked at using food as an attack vector in the United States. The real question is not what would happen if they did attack, it's when will they decide it's the thing they want to attack.
Well, speaking of that, I know in the past we've talked about there's been evidence that Al-Qaeda was considering options for how to possibly contaminate a food supply or conduct an attack through the food system. I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Now, during the invasion of Afghanistan, one of the things that the military uncovered was in the place called Tarnak Farms, which is basically the Al-Qaeda training camp, were a series of documents that detailed how the ways in which you could use food as a vehicle for delivering various types of pathogens to both human and animal populations. So we know that Al-Qaeda had been looking at using the food system as a way of attacking the West. But coming up a little bit more recently. So in the aftermath of the sprout outbreak in Europe, a colleague in Israel had uncovered in a jihadist chat room an interesting message. The message was basically said, if this was an intentional act, great. But even if not, it demonstrates the great utility of using E. coli or similar agents to attack our enemy, rip their guts out, and destroy them. I'm paraphrasing, but that's about what it said. So bad guys are still thinking about it. The question is, when will they decide to do it, and are we going to be ready?
Do you think we're ready?
We are much better off now than we were right after 9/11. Just through awareness alone, we're a whole lot better. And firms have done, in some cases, a great deal to try and protect themselves. But we're not as prepared as we could be. You're never as prepared as you could be for things to go wrong. And the concern that I have is when something does happen, and it's in a way in which we did not anticipate it. Not only what's the human cost, but what is the long-term deleterious impact on our country from the loss of confidence in the food supply, the basic thing we rely on for sustenance. If consumers don't trust their food, they're not going to trust very much else.
All right, Mr. Kennedy, I really appreciate you taking a few minutes to speak with me. It's a really interesting discussion.
Great to talk with you.
Thanks.